What did a bitter wind teach me about forgiveness? Let me explain. But first, let me set the context. It was December of 2016, which was perhaps the most difficult month and definitely the most difficult year of my life. I was living in a faith-based men's recovery home rather than live on the street. I didn't have a car because it had been a piece of crap and it had been a wreck and it wasn't drivable anymore. I had no money. I barely had a job selling vacuum cleaners door to door, which I wasn't very good at. I hadn't seen my kids in a while, and my ex-wife had left the state for another man. I didn't even barely have contact with my family outside of my brother and outside of the court-ordered mandated stuff that they had to do. On top of that, I was dealing with the pain of kidney stones. All that sets up to the fact that basically I had very little to no prospects for the future at the time. And my mindset was bleak. I was barely holding on to any kind of level of sobriety at all. I just didn't know what to do with myself. So, part of living in this faith-based recovery house was that we had Bible study every morning. And on this particular morning, we were talking about the idea of forgiveness and what does forgiveness mean? And does forgiveness have to be complete for it to count at all? And does forgiveness mean that we have to trust that person? And the idea that was discussed, well, one person brought up the idea that if we can't trust a person, that means we didn't forgive them. That means we're still holding on to things and we still need to work on having that forgiveness, working on that forgiveness. And several of the guys in the group agreed with him, but it just didn't sit right with me. That particular day, I had to go downtown to have a doctor's appointment to follow up with about my kidney stones. And like I said, I didn't have a car and I really didn't have any money. But one of the things they did for us living in this house was they would help provide us with bus passes. And if you know anything about me, I am not a bus person. I don't like to wait for things. I don't like to sit there on someone else's schedule. But I kind of had to learn how to do that. On this particular day, it was bitingly cold. It was just chillingly cold. The kind that just kind of almost feels like it's going to peel your skin off. I had to walk down the street. And since I didn't know the bus schedule, I was kind of knew the bus schedule, but I kind of was also just on the whim of whenever the bus showed up. But I kind of knew the idea when the bus was supposed to come. So I had to go stand at this little bus stop with no protection from the wind. And I ended up waiting several minutes. Bus comes, picks me up, drops me off downtown. I had to walk to go to my doctor's appointment, my kidney doctor. Got through with my kidney appointment. And then I had a bunch of time to kill and a distance that I had to walk before I could catch a bus going back to my house. And I was walking and talking with God it was something that I was prone to do at the time because I was trying to just think through all of these things. And it was before I discovered the ability to listen to podcasts. So I did a lot of just thinking. And I remember I was thinking through the Bible study we had that morning and just some of the ideas about forgiveness. And I couldn't shake all the really terrible things that my ex-wife had done to me. And it was just a miserable, miserable conversation with myself. But I came to the place, somehow I had talked myself into the idea that if she ever asked me for forgiveness, if she said, "I'm sorry," in that case, I would be able to and probably just have to forgive her. And I was walking along and I was like, yeah, so if she ever asks for forgiveness, if she ever comes to me and says just the right thing in just the right way, then I will forgive her and I will move on. And I remember I was walking along right next to a building and I came to a spot where there was a break in the building between the two buildings and a gust of wind hit me between those buildings like I was getting slapped with an ice cube. And God dropped it into my mind. Well, what if she never apologizes to you? And I was like, holy crap. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't know that I started crying, but because it was so cold, if I would have probably cried ice cubes, little tiny ice cubes, but it just hit me like a ton of bricks. She might never say that she's sorry. She might never come to me and say, "Andrew, I made a mistake." please forgive me, and then list out all of the mistakes that she made. That might not be a realistic possibility. As a matter of fact, it was very unlikely. She had done some pretty horrendous things up to that point and not really asked me for forgiveness for any of them, even while we were still together. And I remember I just kept walking, and because I still had time to wait for the bus and still had a little distance to walk. And as I'm talking with God about this whole thing, it dropped into my mind that forgiveness is about me. Forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person. And that you might never have the opportunity. What if they die in a car wreck? What if something happens to them and you never see them and you never have communication with them ever again? And you then are stuck with all that unforgiveness. You then are the one that's living in bondage to all of that, right? Because natural things might completely wipe them out, and you might never, ever get that chance. So are you going to allow yourself to be burdened by that? And so that was the beginning of that thought process. This was the beginning of me starting to unpack all of this ideas about forgiveness. And if you want to know more about all of this, like I go and unpack these stories and these ideas more and more in my podcast and on my social media. So if you're interested, check out my social media down in the links. There's a blog in there. There's Instagram. There's Facebook. There's my audio podcast, which goes back even further than the YouTube one. So check all that stuff out down below. Feel free to reach out to me. And while you're at it, give the video a like, share a comment, share the links with your friends. I go a lot more into the topic of forgiveness and working through some of that stuff. So that was the beginning of my journey to figuring out about forgiveness. So then I moved to Yakima not long after that. And I remember I was sitting in a meeting at one point, and someone in the meeting was sharing, and they said something that pretty much changed my life. And it confirmed the things that kind of had been happening up to that point. And they said, holding on to forgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, holy, because it described it so perfectly. And that's a quote. They didn't come up with that, but that's a quote. I can't remember exactly who said it, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. And when you hold on to unforgiveness, that doesn't do you any good. That doesn't help you at all. It just holds you back and holds you down and keeps you from reaching your potential. Because you are controlled by that other person. You are controlled by that circumstance. And the other thing, it wasn't in that meeting, but as I started to go to meetings, I heard someone else talk about the idea that forgiveness doesn't mean trust. And that took me back to that day in that Bible study where the person said that in order to forgive, you have to trust them. And when someone gave me permission that I didn't have to, that forgiveness didn't mean trust. That forgiveness didn't mean you have to forget, because you can't forget. It's impossible. It is in your brain. You can move on and you can decrease the power of that memory, but you can't forget it, and you shouldn't forget it. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Okay? So if you forget all those lessons that you've learned from the mistakes that you've made and the things that you have done and the things that other people have done to you, if you forget those things, then all those lessons were for naught. They don't mean anything. So forgiveness doesn't mean trust. Even to this day, even all these years later, if I saw my ex-wife, and even though that I've worked really hard at forgiving her, there's just no way at this point that I'd be able to trust her, and I definitely wouldn't trust her around my kids. And there are other people that have done things like that. If someone robs me, I can forgive them, but that doesn't mean I have to let them in my house. If someone hurts me in some way, I can forgive them, but I can still keep my distance. I can still not allow them in my life, and that's okay. And there is nothing wrong with that. So, 3 things about forgiveness. First of all, forgiveness is for you. It has nothing to do with them. Point number 2, holding on to unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't hurt them at all. And number 3, forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean trusting either. And those concepts, those are some of the biggest things that I have learned about forgiveness. So I want to finish up with one thing here, and I'm going to read one of my favorite scriptures in regards to forgiveness. And my friend Isaiah, he watches the podcast and listens, and so he'll get a kick out of this because I mentioned his name, because he was talking about this verse the other night. It's Matthew 18:21 and 22. And it says, "Then Peter came up and said to him," he's talking to Jesus, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Like there's a limit. Then Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. And if you understand scripture, and if you understand the meaning of words and the meaning of numbers in scripture, what he's referring to is it's not an exact number. It's not like, so 70 times 7 is 490. Does that mean that on the 491st sin that you don't forgive him anymore? No. The point is that, so 7 is the number of perfection and completion. So what it really means is that it's infinite. Forgive them every single time. Forgive them all the time. There's no limit to the amount and to the number of times you can forgive someone. And the way I read it too is that it's not just talking about quantity either. There's a quality aspect to it too. It doesn't matter the number of times that someone has sinned against you, and it doesn't even matter the severity of the sin against you. We are still commanded to forgive. Because if God put that number on us, if he said, "Andrew, I'll forgive you 490 times, but on the 491st, you're doomed, you're condemned," then I surpassed that mark within probably the first year of my life, if not quicker. And nowadays, I probably would surpass that number weekly. I don't know. I have never stopped and counted up my sins. But basically that number, 70 times 7, basically means it's infinite. It's also infinite in quality and quantity. This is a study Bible, and there's a great little commentary at the bottom here. And it says, "As many as 7 times. In view of the costly procedure that Jesus has laid out for our reclamation and recovery of brothers and sisters in sin, Peter wants to know the boundaries of his obligation to confront and forgive sin." So Peter is looking for the limits. He's looking for the edges. He's looking for where maybe where he can maybe push the boundaries. Peter wants to know the boundaries of his obligation to confront and forgive. Jesus, 70 times 7, vividly removes all limits to our obligation to forgive, setting a cap so high that scorekeeping is impossible. This parable then reveals the logic by which unimaginable divine forgiveness must evoke in its recipient an eager readiness to forgive the minor debts that we exact one from another. So basically that's reiterating what I was saying, that Christ has forgiven us so many times for so many things, big and small, that there's no way we should ever hold that against anyone else. We should try to forgive as infinitely as Christ. We are woefully inadequate, but through his power, we can work on it and we can get close. So that's how a bitter wind taught me about forgiveness. My advice to you today, my reassurance to you is it is possible for you to forgive. And that doesn't mean that you have to forget, and that doesn't mean that you have to trust. But holding on to that will only hold you back. It doesn't hold them back. That's what apology is about. Forgiveness is for you. Apology is for them. One last thing while I have your attention. Hold on a second. I like my beard. It's not the most thick and luscious beard that I've ever seen, but it's really growing on me. I'm allowed to say that. It's a dad joke. I'm a dad, so I get to do that. Anyway, while I have your attention, forgiveness doesn't come all at once. Forgiveness is something that takes time. It's been 8 years down the road, and I still work on every day trying to forgive my wife, my ex-wife, more and more. So don't think that just because you're still holding on to a little bit that you haven't put the work in. It does take time. So allow yourself to take the time that you need. So again, I'd like to just encourage you that if you got anything out of this, share it with somebody, make a comment, reach out to me in my social media down in the description. I hope to talk to you again.
So if you like this content, please give it a rating, a review, and share it with your friends. Also, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me and what I'm all about and what I can maybe do for you, check out my website at thedangerousgentleman.org. That's thedangerousgentleman.org. Thank you for listening.